In the southwestern part of the state, in the shadow of Mount Monadnock, lies the small city of Keene, New Hampshire. As the summer of 1983 was about to turn to fall, I once again found myself heading west on Route 101 back to Keene State College to begin my 4th year as a film student there. My friend and roommate of the previous 2 years, Craig Downing, had decided he would take a single room that had become available in Owl's Nest 4, where we both had shared a room the year before. So, unlike my first 3 years of living on campus, this year I would live off campus. I decided to take a room in a rooming house on Roxbury Street. My friend John Sullivan had lived there, and enthusiastically recommended this as a great place to stay. I missed my friend John, who had graduated the previous spring. It was a little odd at first not living on campus right in the middle of everything, but it didn't take long to settle into a comfortable routine. The rooming house was much quieter than living in a dorm, with the blaring stereos, endlessly ringing communal telephone, and the usual loud party on the weekends. Aside from my regular slate of classes, most of my time was spent in Parker Hall at the Film Center. Old Drennan Auditorium was now a movie theater where most of the film theory classes were held, and it was also where the Film Society showed their films. There was a classroom on the 3rd floor for the film production classes, and Bob Gunther, who was hired the previous year as Larry Benequist's assistant, had his office there. Bob was an amazing individual. He was a large, rotund man in his early 50s with a dynamic and extroverted personality that matched his physical stature. Bob also had an extensive background in theater arts, radio, television, and the movies, having worked in Hollywood as a child actor. Bob could be quite intimidating. It's not that I was afraid of him, but I did tend to stay out of his way. Larry kept encouraging me to try and get to know Bob. He kept telling me that Bob was a wonderful resource of information and that he could help me a great deal with my film productions. One afternoon, I was up in the Film Center with a few of my fellow classmates. As we were heading downstairs, Bob stuck his head out of his office door and asked if he could speak with me for a minute. I said sure, and stepped into his office. I was thinking, oh God, have I done something wrong? Bob looked at me and said very directly, Danny, I've noticed you tend to avoid me. Why didn't you come to me last semester and ask for help with your film project? I gulped and said, well, I didn't think that someone like you would be interested in helping me with my little film projects. Bob stared at me for a moment, and with a particular look of disdain that only he could muster, said, why do you think I'm here? I would love to help you with your films. I was quite taken back by his directness, but I was also relieved. Bob had opened the door for me to his knowledge and experience, a door that I was too intimidated to open by myself. From that moment on, Bob and I would become good friends. He asked me if I was working on a project for this year, I said I had a few ideas that I was kicking around in my head, but nothing I was very happy with. "When you have something down on paper," he said, "bring it to me, and we can discuss it." I told him I would, and thanked him for offering to help me. A couple of weeks later, Bob and I found a new and unique way of getting ourselves into hot water with Larry Benequist. Several times each semester, a batch of black and white 8mm movie film from the production class would be taken down to Film Service Lab on Berkeley Street in Boston for processing. The film would be dropped off in the morning, processed, and then picked up several hours later. The hours between drop-off and pickup afforded those who made the run to Boston plenty of time to explore and get into all sorts of trouble. Bob and I were no exception. On this day, we decided to go across the river to Cambridge and stop into a company called Super 8 Sound on Harvey Street. Super 8 Sound sold all sorts of professional equipment for shooting and editing of 8mm films. We were looking at 8mm movie cameras that were on display when suddenly, there it was, a Braun Niso 6080, the holy grail of 8mm movie cameras. Bob asked the clerk if we could take a closer look at it. Wow, the films I could make with this fancy piece of hardware. Then I saw the price tag. Well over $1,600. Well, it was a nice dream while it lasted. As Larry's assistant, Bob controlled the purse strings to the Film Society's pocketbook. Believe me when I tell you, he guarded every nickel with his life. I turned to ask Bob if he wanted to grab a little lunch while we were in Cambridge. If you only could have seen the look on Bob's face. Maybe it was the mischievous twinkle in his eyes. Or perhaps it was the wry smile on his face, as if he were Santa Claus saying, "Yes, little boy, this camera will be under the tree for you on Christmas morning." I just knew that trouble was afoot, and I said to him, "Bob, if we buy this camera, Larry will have us flogged, drawn and quartered, and burned at the stake on the front lawn of Parker Hall." He was undeterred. We went back to Keene with the processed film and a new camera. We both took our medicine like men as we sat apprehensively in Larry's office. Let me describe to you the reaction when we showed Larry the holy grail of 8mm movie cameras. It began with a slow burn. We described all the amazing features. The high-quality Schneider optics, the 200-foot film load capacity, the in-camera dissolve feature, slow motion, and a backwinder for special effects. Then we told Larry the price. It ended with Larry flipping me the bird as I looked at him through the viewfinder of, you guessed it, the holy grail of 8mm movie cameras. Bob and I both survived our close brush with death that day, but it all worked out in the end. I didn't realize it at the time, but the purchase of this movie camera would eventually lead to something very special for me in the not-too-distant future. Since my own film projects were generally done as independent studies, Larry asked me if I'd be willing to help out in the beginning film production class. Most of the students in the class, Peter Condon, Kathy Turnus, Joe Jakowski, and Lovell Richardson, were already friends of mine, and they were also members of the Film Society. Peter Condon came to me one day and asked if I would be willing to be the cameraman on his project. He was doing a parody of a scene from the Louis Malle film Atlantic City. The scene Peter had chosen to parody was the famous scene where Susan Sarandon washes the odor of fish from her arms and breasts with the juice from fresh-cut lemons, while her neighbor, played by Burt Lancaster, watches her from his window across the way. I asked Peter, "Who's playing the parts of Burt Lancaster and Susan Sarandon?" He told me, "Bob Gunther and Lovell Richardson." I said, "I assume you're putting a comic twist on it." "Yes," he said. "Count me in," I said. A few days later, Peter, Bob, and I, along with a car full of film gear, piled into my little gray Chevette, dubbed the Pregnant Roller Skate by Craig and John. It was a beautiful day as we drove the 12 miles south towards the tiny town of Fitzwilliam, where Lovell lived. Lovell was an intelligent, attractive young woman with a magnetic smile and a cascade of beautiful red hair that fell from her shoulders all the way down her back. When we arrived, we all grabbed a handful of film gear and traipsed inside. Lovell greeted us, and we all sat down to discuss the fine points of Peter's parody of Atlantic City. Instead of Lovell washing herself with juice from fresh-cut lemons, Peter decided to add such comic staples as a banana and a wild assortment of other fruits and vegetables. Lovell would then toss this diverse concoction into a blender, pulverize it, and then somehow discreetly slather this gooey mixture on herself, all the while managing to maintain a PG rating so we could actually show the film in class. Bob, on the other hand, had to do his best over-the-top comic rendition of Burt Lancaster's voyeur, who is watching this demented scene through her window from across the way. We set up the lighting around the kitchen sink and filmed a small series of shots from inside. Then we moved onto the deck and filmed the point of view shots of Lovell from Bob's perspective. How Lovell managed to maintain her dignity while smearing that nasty mixture on herself, I'll never know. But somehow, she did. Next, we filmed the voyeur shots of Bob watching through the window, while Lovell jumped into the shower to wash off the vile fruit concoction. It was almost impossible to keep a straight face, while Bob, a true professional, did his thing. He was very expressive and extremely funny. Meanwhile, we could hear Lovell in the shower saying, "Ew," as the gooey fruit salad swirled down the drain. After filming was completed, we all sat around drinking coffee, talking and laughing about the scenes we had just shot. Peter was very pleased with how the filming went, and all of us had an amazing time learning tricks of the trade from Bob. I was quite taken with Lovell. She bravely jumped right in and tackled this silly scene. She was bright, intelligent, had a great sense of humor, and didn't seem to mind getting her hands or other parts of her dirty. It had been a wonderful day, and my stomach hurt from all the laughs that we'd shared together. When I got back to my room on Roxbury Street, I was still energized by the amazing day that had just transpired. I couldn't wait to see my friends again, especially Lovell. In the fall of 1983, I was beginning my third year as president of the Keene State College Film Society. I no longer recall exactly how it came about or who suggested the idea, but in a unanimous vote, we decided to hold a showing of the 3 films that I had produced as a film student. A grand film premiere, with everyone getting dressed up in their Sunday best, with formal invitations and a reception. The next few weeks were very busy ones, coming up with the guest list, sending out the invitations, creating a program, and not to mention preparing for midterms. The world premiere of The Key Connection, Reminiscing, and the award-winning film Hangover was set for the night of December 10th, 1983 at 8 p.m. in Drennan Auditorium, with a reception prior to the show. The local newspapers, the Keene Sentinel, the Monadnock Observer, the Equinox, the college newspaper, as well as the Manchester Union Leader, New Hampshire's only statewide newspaper, all published articles about the event. My family, friends, faculty, dignitaries from the college administration and New Hampshire's state government, and of course, the cast and crew members from all 3 films were in attendance. The reception went by in a flash. I spent those 90 minutes greeting guests, having photos taken with my family, friends, and dignitaries, but especially with the actors, without whose contributions and hard work the films we were about to watch wouldn't even exist. I can never adequately thank them for all they contributed to those projects. I know at times it was an imposition on them, and I am forever grateful that they stayed with me to see it through. The films were shown in order of their production and were very well received. I would give a little background about each film before it was shown, and afterwards I had the great pleasure of acknowledging the contributions of those involved. It was so much fun to ask these great friends to stand and take a bow. After the last film was shown, Kate Phillips, Hollywood actress, screenwriter, my teacher and friend, gave a brief talk about student filmmaking. As a teacher, Kate had an amazing ability to make you feel like you and your project were the most important thing in the world. She inspired all of us to be better than we thought we could be. I will always love her for that, and I miss her very much. At the end of this incredible evening, my parents, Fran and George Paul, were heading out to dinner with Larry Benequist. My dad came over to me. He was just glowing with pride. My dad was not one to hand out praise liberally when we were growing up, but he always told you if you had done a good job. With a huge smile on his face, he said, "We're very proud." I was on cloud 9. If I had won an Academy Award that night, it would have paled in comparison to receiving that compliment from my father. It was the end of the fall semester, and the film students' final projects were heading towards completion. My friend Lovell was making a documentary. She had shot her film using the new camera because of its ability to handle the 200-foot film cartridges. When her film came back from processing, she was stunned to learn that none of it had been exposed. For Lovell, this meant that she would not have time to complete her film prior to the end of the semester. She had purchased the film at 2 different establishments, one in Cambridge and one in Boston, but she was not very comfortable driving to Boston by herself. So, I offered my services as chauffeur for the trip. Lovell and I had decided that we both should dress up for this trip to present a professional and serious-looking demeanor that we hoped would increase her odds of receiving a refund on the film. We went to Super 8 Sound in Cambridge first, and, much to our surprise, They promptly refunded Lovell's cash. We were both getting hungry, so we went over to the Ground Round on Fresh Pond Circle for lunch. We had a great time getting to know each other, and I asked her what she planned to do after graduation in the spring. Lovell said she was going to go to graduate school in Santa Fe, New Mexico, to continue her studies in film. This surprised me, since I didn't know there was a film school in Santa Fe. She also said that she was anxious to leave New Hampshire because she would like to live somewhere else. At that point, her bright demeanor seemed to dim ever so briefly, so I decided not to press the issue. We enjoyed our lunch together, but then it was time to head across the Charles River to Boston to see if our luck would hold as we attempted to secure the other half of Lovell's refund. We strode confidently into Film Service Lab on Berkeley Street. Unfortunately, the technician who waited on us was not impressed by our professional dress and serious demeanor. He steadfastly refused to refund Lovell's money, claiming, "No, it's not the film, it's the camera." He was not about to budge an inch. I felt bad that Lovell couldn't get all her money back. I also realized that now we most likely had an issue with our brand new, expensive movie camera. We climbed into the car and began heading for home. Our disappointment at the film lab in no way diminished the wonderful day we were having. It was becoming obvious that we liked each other, and as we continued our conversation, we were in no hurry to get back home. At one point along the way, I put a cassette into the tape player of some Motown music I had recorded. It provided a nice background to our give and take. As we approached the New Hampshire state line, the song "My Girl" by The Temptations came on. The conversation stopped for a few seconds. Our eyes met for a moment, and she smiled. She had such a beautiful smile. A short time later, we were pulling into her driveway in Fitzwilliam. The sun was beginning to set, and I had to get back to campus for a 7 p.m. class. Lovell looked at me and said, "Would you like to come in for a bit?" Oh, how I wanted to stay and spend more time with her. But missing a 3-hour film class prior to midterms, even with a good excuse, would have gotten me into trouble. I told her I wanted to come in, but I had to go to class. She understood my dilemma. She thanked me for taking her to Boston and for helping her to get her money back. I thanked her for a wonderful afternoon and told her how happy I was that we were able to spend the day together. We looked at each other for a few moments. Then she leaned over and kissed me on the cheek, and we shared a wonderful, warm embrace. It's truly mind-boggling how subtle twists of fate can alter the course of our lives. I think back to this day, and I realize that if it were not for a defective movie camera, this amazing day that Lovell and I spent together never would have happened at all. After returning from Christmas break, I was still struggling to come up with a good story for my next film project, and time was becoming my enemy. It was 4 a.m. on a cold Friday morning in February when suddenly I awoke with the idea for my next project. It was inspired by the film noir classic Double Indemnity. In my story, the wife wants the best friend to bump off the husband, so she and the best friend can live happily ever after. I had come up with a good beginning and a solid ending, but ran into a snag with the middle part of the story, and my script stalled. After an entire day of frustration, I remembered Bob Gunther's offer to help me with my next project. Actually, it was more like a threat if I didn't ask. Bob was very enthusiastic about my story. I could see the wheels turning in his mind as we began to toss ideas back and forth, when suddenly he said, "It's all right there. You just don't see it." "See what?" I said. Grinning from ear to ear, Bob suggested that the best friend and the husband were gay lovers. And when the best friend confesses to the husband about the wife's plot to kill him, they decide to turn the tables on her. Now that's a twist. Even though Bob's suggestion was risque, especially for a college film in 1984, I had to admit it was a wonderful idea. It turned my ordinary, simple story into something special. I said, "Okay, let's do it." He said, "Great! I'd like to produce this film for you." My immediate reaction was to turn him down. I wasn't comfortable having someone else spend their own money on my film projects. Bob would not back down. He insisted he wanted to do this and wouldn't take no for an answer. I agreed to his terms, like I had a choice, and we shook hands on our upcoming collaboration. For me, one of the best parts of this deal was that now Bob would be helping us shoot the movie. I told Bob that I was thinking of casting my friend Bob Ford as Jim, and he agreed. Bob suggested Jack Hitchner, a friend of his, for Alex. He said Jack was an incredibly talented actor and would love to do a film. That left the part of Jennifer. Bob said he had someone in mind who could handle the role, and that he would give her and Jack a call to see if they would be interested. The next evening at Film Society, Bob informed me that Jack Hitchner was an enthusiastic yes to play Alex. Unfortunately, the woman he had in mind to play Jennifer had just moved to Portland, Maine, and would not be able to do the film. Bob and I seemed to get the same idea at the same time. We both looked across the lobby to where Lovell was sitting. She was reading a copy of the script that I'd just given her a few minutes earlier. We both walked over to her, and Bob said, "We have a proposition for you." Lovell looked up. She quickly realized what we were about to ask her. She was a little hesitant at first, but jokingly said, "Well, it's only 9 or 10 lines. What the hell?" Bob went upstairs to check on the film we were showing that night, which gave Lovell and I a chance to talk. "You know, Dan, after Peter's film, I said I would never get in front of a camera again. You're my friend, and I'm doing this for you. I want to help you." I thanked her and told her how much I appreciated that she decided to play the part. She also told me that because of the type of woman that Jennifer is, and the way that the character is treated in the film, that it went against a lot of her personal beliefs, and that this would make it difficult for her to portray that type of person. To help boost her confidence, I told her that many actors often find it easier to play someone they are not, rather than trying to play themselves in front of the camera. She wasn't entirely sure that was true, but she smiled and said she was looking forward to working on this film project with me. We were planning to shoot the first scene of my film, now titled Just You and Me, on the final Saturday of spring break at my folks' house in Hampton. I was chomping at the bit to get started. When Saturday finally rolled around, the cast and crew decided to eat at Newick Seafood Restaurant to to charge our batteries before we started working. I'll never forget that meal. What an eclectic mix of funny, creative, and wonderfully warped individuals we were. At the end of dinner, Lovell asked, "Would anyone mind if I smoked?" Joe Jakowski immediately quipped, "Not at all. Do you mind if I fart?" We finished our dinner, and at last it was time to get started. At this point, Bob Gunther went to work and began to teach us all how to really shoot a film. We all sat down around a table on the set and began to go over the scene we were about to shoot line by line. This was exactly the kind of instruction I was looking for. At last, I was able to see the correct way to rehearse actors for shooting a scene. This was a huge difference from my usual method of memorize the line, rehearse it once or twice, and then shoot it. Bob took us through every line, every reaction, and every voice inflection. It was obvious right away that Lovell and Bob Ford were much more comfortable as actors with this approach than when compared to my old work habits. Next, we moved to the set and ran through the entire scene a section at a time. After 3.5 hours of rehearsal, it was time to start filming. The scene went very smoothly thanks to Bob's extensive preparation. Lovell and Bob Ford had a nice chemistry together. I was incredibly pleased to see how both of them seemed to tap right into the inner qualities of their characters. After about 3 hours of filming, we finished the scene and called it a wrap. Then we all headed downstairs for a much-needed cup of coffee. I really enjoyed this wrap session. I could have kept talking with everyone all night. We made our plans to film at Bob Gunther's house on Monday, and Lovell, Bob, and Joe left to head back to Keene. The good feelings from the weekend seemed to carry right over into Monday. Bob Ford arrived in Keene late that afternoon, and our little band of crazies invaded Bob Gunther's home in Marlborough that would become the interior for Alex and Jennifer's apartment. When we arrived, Bob introduced us all to Jack Hitchner. I liked Jack right away. He was a friendly, intelligent man who had a great sense of humor. I knew he'd fit right in with the rest of the group. Bob also warned us all that we'd have to keep the noise level to a minimum that night because his partner Ed was not feeling well and was trying to get some rest. We all sat down at the kitchen table, and once again, Bob held court as we went over the script and rehearsed the scenes we planned to shoot that evening. Jack's talent was obvious. I intuitively knew that casting him as Alex was the right decision, and that he would help to elevate everyone else's performance as well. Filming began, and we were making progress. Unfortunately, the longer we continued to work, the noisier things became. Bob kept checking on Ed, who wasn't having much luck getting any sleep. After a couple of hours, Ed reached a boiling point and got upset about all the racket. Bob rushed in to pacify Ed, while we stood around feeling a little like children who got caught with our hands in the cookie jar. When Bob came back, he apologized for Ed's outburst. All of us understood and insisted that no apology was necessary. We decided to call it a day. It was a glitch in our plans, but not an insurmountable one. The next night, Bob Gunther and I spent several hours with Bob Ford, shooting the scene where Jim climbs the stairs to Alex and Jennifer's third-floor apartment. It was a dramatic sequence of shots, with the master shot taken from the perspective of the camera hanging over the third-floor railing looking directly down to the first floor as Jim reluctantly climbs the stairs. Once again, Bob Gunther's attention to detail was extraordinary. He tutored Bob Ford on every gesture, every nuance, and every step of his climb up those stairs. It was a classroom on directing being taught by a master. This was exactly the type of hands-on experience I was hoping for when Bob offered to help with this project. We did several takes of this shot until it was exactly right. I had never spent so much time filming one sequence. Early the following week, the first batch of film came back from the lab. I spent that afternoon cutting the raw footage together and syncing up the sound so we could watch it later that evening. Everyone was fairly happy with what we saw. The few scenes that we'd shot at Bob's house were excellent, and the stairway sequence was spectacular. However, we all agreed that the opening scene that we had spent so much time on in Hampton was a disappointment. The scene just didn't work. As we were leaving, Lovell came up to me with a question. She asked me if I would like to come over to her house tomorrow night and meet her mom and show her the scenes that we'd shot so far. I said I'd love to. We agreed on a time and headed our separate ways. I looked forward to any opportunity to spend time with her. When I arrived at her house the following evening, Lovell introduced me to her mom, Barbara. She was a kind, intelligent woman with a pleasant personality. She also projected a palpable air of authority and confidence. After we said our hellos, Lovell's mom turned to me and with an almost imperceptible touch of sarcasm said, "So, what have you been doing to my daughter?" That caught my attention. It made me immediately aware that Lovell had discussed the script and the character of Jennifer with her mom. I wondered what else Lovell had told her about me. The conversation continued as I set up the projector and the screen. Her mom was quite interested in the scenes and was asking questions along the way. We did our best to answer them and provide some context for the unedited footage. When the screening ended, the conversation began again. What happened next wasn't exactly the Spanish Inquisition, but it was a powerful lesson about sexism and how women are treated in the movies. They were very nice about it, but I was most definitely outnumbered. Lovell's mom voiced the same objections about the character of Jennifer, how she behaved, and how she was treated in my story, as Lovell had when I asked her if she would play the role. I simply explained that the Jennifer character gets what is coming to her in terms of the story, because she is manipulating the two male characters by having one murder the other. So when Alex and Jim decide to turn the tables on her, it was just a dramatic story device, not a male versus female issue. At that point, Lovell and her mom pointed out something to me that I didn't realize, nor would have even thought of at that point in my life. They pointed out that in my story, the character of Jennifer was being punished for being an assertive and aggressive female and for not behaving in a feminine manner. They said that she was essentially being told that she had better keep her place or something bad and violent might happen to her. They also pointed out that males are not treated this way in the movies. Males are often rewarded for that type of behavior. Wow, that was a lot for me to process all at once. I never imagined when I went over there that night that sexism would become the topic of conversation as it related to my little film project. I will say that to this very day, whenever I'm writing a female character in a screenplay, I remember that conversation. I didn't fully grasp all of its nuances that night, but it made a lasting impression on me. Going to college certainly was an education. A little while later, Lovell's mom said goodnight and went up to bed. Lovell made some coffee and we sat down for a long talk. We had known each other for a couple of years now, but it wasn't until this year that we became close friends. Working on this film project was bringing us even closer. We began to discuss if we should take our friendship to a more intimate level. I had never had a physical relationship with anyone. I was going to turn 24 in less than 3 months, and at that point had resigned myself to the fact that I would probably die a virgin. This was no easy decision. We were genuinely concerned that sex could end up destroying our friendship. Mind you, as we sat there holding each other, temptation was making it more and more difficult to make a calm and rational decision. We talked until the early hours of the morning and eventually decided we should sleep on it. Not together, separately. She walked me to the door, we hugged and said goodnight. As I got into my car and headed back to Keene, my mind was racing with a million thoughts. Oh God, did we make the right decision? Should I have kissed her? Should we have spent the night together? Am I going to be a virgin the rest of my life? What's going to happen now? I don't even remember how I got back to Roxbury Street in Keene. I couldn't stop thinking about her. I wondered if she was thinking about me. I slept until early afternoon. I watched the film footage again and wondered if Bob had any thoughts on how to fix the problems with the first scene. I was also thinking about Lovell and everything we discussed the night before. As day turned into evening, I decided to give her a call. As the phone began to ring, I was filled with nervous anticipation. She said hello in a cheery voice, and I could feel my heart rate go up. This turned out to be a very short conversation. I asked her what she was doing. She said, "Nothing. Would you like to come over to my place so we can talk some more?" These were her exact words to me. "Okay, but no sex." I said, "Okay," and hung up the phone. 30 minutes later, she was knocking on the door to my room. I slid open the huge wooden door, and she gave me a big hug. She took off her coat, and we decided to sit down on the bed together. We picked up our conversation from where we had left off the night before. She was holding my hand in front of her and gently massaging my palm and fingers. Slowly, she began bringing my hand in close to her. We exchanged a brief glance, and I touched her apprehensively. Her reaction told me everything. We began kissing passionately. Suddenly, articles of clothing began flying through the air and landing on the rug like a random shower of meteors. "Do you know how long I've been trying to get you to touch me?" she said. "Do you know how long I've wanted to?" She kissed me again and said, "Why didn't you?" I replied, "You said no sex, remember?" "Oh yeah, I did," she said with a smile. We spent a wonderful, passionate night together. The time was right, and it was with the right person. I wasn't going to die a virgin after all. The next morning, there were no regrets. We got dressed and decided it was important to have an honest conversation with each other about last night. We agreed that just because this happened one time didn't necessarily mean it was going to happen again. Our friendship was the most important thing, and we didn't want that to change. Lovell also said, and I was already aware of this, that she was leaving in the fall to go to school in Santa Fe, so this couldn't and wouldn't be a long-term relationship. We both agreed to those ground rules, and I walked her out to the kitchen door. As we were saying our goodbyes, one of my housemates, the woman who happened to have the room next to mine, came out into the kitchen. I kissed Lovell goodbye and sent her on her way. As I turned to head back to my room, my housemate gave me a big smile. Suddenly I realized why she was smiling. The bed in my room was up against the wall that divided her room from mine. That wall was only a few strips of thin paneling that separated what at one time had been one large room. It was obvious that she had heard everything that had gone on the night before. I started to walk out of the kitchen, stopped and turned to her, and said, "So, was it as good for you as it was for me?" She blushed as I flashed her a smile and left the kitchen. The next day, Bob, Lovell, and I were talking about the movie and why the first scene wasn't working. We came up with a number of issues that were troublesome, and in the end, we decided we should reshoot the entire segment. In the past, I couldn't afford to reshoot entire segments that I wasn't happy with, but this was another benefit of Bob Gunther being the film's producer. About a week later, we all piled into 2 cars for the trip back to Hampton. This time, my parents were home when we invaded their peaceful sanctuary. Bob Ford was waiting for us when we arrived. By now, the actors were more comfortable with their characters, and a large amount of rehearsal was no longer necessary. In the new version of the scene, Lovell is wearing a peach-colored dress that gave her character a softer look and helped to separate her visually from the background, and Bob Ford ditched the dark glasses. We also changed a couple of camera angles and made a conscious effort to slow the pace of the scene just a little. This allowed Lovell to play Jennifer in a more seductive manner as she attempted to coerce Bob Ford's Jim into doing her bidding. After a couple of hours, my mom brought us up some coffee and a bite to eat. As I've previously mentioned, we were a warped bunch, and I've got the pictures to prove it. Bob Ford and Joe Jakowski were the big instigators behind this lunacy. In one photo, Lovell and Kathy Turnus posed together as Jim and Jennifer. Then Lovell and I posed in a couple of goofy shots, one of which we are spoofing a couple from an infamous TV commercial. Honey, that's great coffee. There is also an unintentionally humorous shot of Bob Gunther and Bob Ford holding hands while rehearsing a segment of a scene that we were going to shoot later in the production. After all the shenanigans, we had to get back to work. It was getting late and we were keeping my folks up. We finished filming the last shots we needed, thanked my folks for allowing us to come back and disrupt their house for a second time, picked up our gear and headed back to Keene. Kathy and Joe rode back with Bob Gunther, while Lovell and I rode back together. We were still pretty energized, and it took us a while to wind down. By the time we'd driven the 2 hours back to Keene, we were exhausted. We had already planned that she would spend the night, and we were starting to spend more and more of them together. Her friendship meant the world to me, and being with her was a dream come true. She was nourishment for my heart and soul. The following weekend, we were back at Bob Gunther's house, shooting the final scenes needed to complete the film. These were dramatic scenes that presented both acting and technical challenges. They included Jennifer's death scene, where Alex turns the tables and shoots Jennifer. The biggest acting challenge was Lovell's. The character of Jennifer is shot after taking a shower, and while wearing only a towel, must slowly collapse in the bathtub with blood dripping from her mouth and die on screen. It sounds easy, but it's not. Lovell had told me that because of the way that the character of Jennifer is treated in the film, that it would make it difficult for her to play the role. I thought I understood what she meant when she explained it that night, but now it was obvious that I did not. This scene genuinely troubled her. She had to work herself up, even to rehearse it. As she stood there in the bathtub, with her hair wet and wrapped in a damp towel, she asked us all to leave her alone for a few minutes while she composed herself. There was no joking on the set at this point. Everyone got incredibly quiet. It troubled me greatly that I was putting my friend, someone I now cared deeply for, through this emotional trial just for a scene in a movie. After a few minutes, she said, "Okay, I'm ready." The only people she allowed in the room were Bob Gunther and I. Everyone else stayed out in the living room. Before the camera rolled, Lovell had to take a mouthful of Hershey's chocolate syrup. This was used to simulate the blood that she would let run from her mouth as she slid down the shower wall. The problem at this point was not technical or emotional. It was Lovell. She kept swallowing the chocolate syrup. We were all amused by this, and it helped to lighten a tense moment. At last, we were ready. For her sake, I only wanted to do this once. Softly, I said action, as Bob Gunther called out bang, bang, to simulate the two gunshots. Her expression went blank as she slid down the wall and let the blood drip from her mouth, when unexpectedly the mic boom appeared in the middle of the shot. I angrily said cut. It was a stupid blunder. I had screwed up, and now she had to work herself up all over again to do a second take. I asked her if she wanted us to leave the room while she composed herself. She said no, let's get this over with. The second take went off without a hitch. Bob and I helped her to her feet, and I asked her if she was okay. She told us she was, and that she wanted to rinse off the chocolate syrup and get warm. She took a few more swigs from the chocolate syrup bottle as if it were a stiff drink and said, "Okay, let me get cleaned up now." Bob and I grabbed the camera gear and headed out to the living room. We began to set up for the next shot. This one also needed to be perfect on the first take. It was the shot immediately following Jennifer's death in the bathtub. It was the completion of an in-camera dissolve from her body to Jim sitting in a smoking jacket reading a book. Technically, it had to be perfect. If I messed up, or if Bob Ford playing Jim made a mistake, we would have to shoot Jennifer's death scene again. I wasn't about to let that happen. Besides, if we had screwed up, I'm certain Lovell really would have killed us all. With all the major scenes now in the can, we spent the next afternoon shooting publicity photos. We took several group photos, as well as posed scenes with the actors in character. We also shot a series of photos to use as prop surveillance pictures for a new opening sequence that Bob Gunther and I had come up with. These were fun to create, and they primarily involved Bob Ford and his character Jim posing with a number of lovely ladies from the Keene State campus. A few days later, we were headed back to Boston to drop off the last batch of film for processing. I was anxious to see the scenes we'd shot and start cutting them into the project. On our way back to Keene, just before we got to the outskirts of town, Lovell took us on a little detour. There was a sign ahead that said Roxbury. She told me to take the next right because she wanted to show me something. My curiosity was piqued as we drove along a back road and began to climb uphill. She would not tell me where we were going. We finally took a turnoff, drove a short distance, and stopped. We were high above on a bluff overlooking a dam and Otter Brook Lake. I had never been there before, and it was an incredibly beautiful scenic area. Lovell turned to me and said, "I want to make love with you." Now I ask you, how could I turn down that offer? We got into the back of my Chevette and made ourselves comfortable. The problem was, when we arrived there, we had the entire place to ourselves. After we'd been there for a few minutes, it seemed as if the entire population of Keene had decided to join us. Since it was still daylight and the unwanted company was most definitely not welcome, we decided it was best to head down the hill to my place. The final batch of film was excellent. The reshot first scene was a marked improvement over the first try, and now it was time to put our movie together. A few days later, Lovell and I were talking about our relationship. I was incredibly happy with things the way they were. I wanted to spend as much time together as we could before the semester ended and before she had to leave for Santa Fe. She was getting worried about completing all of her schoolwork in time for graduation in a few weeks. I could sense the anxiety this was causing her, and our relationship was complicating the matter. We had become quite a distraction to one another. Between shooting the movie and our spending so much time together, we had both let a lot of other things slide. Soon, her anxiety would become mine as well. I was falling in love with her. I couldn't help myself. I was happier than I had ever been in my life, and being with her was intoxicating. My feelings were stronger than my judgment, and I knew all too well that circumstance would eventually force our relationship to come to an end. Beginning in 1980, Bob Ford's mom began a tradition of taking us all to Fenway Park to see the Red Sox on opening day. Bob called me and informed me that his mom had an extra ticket and wondered if I wanted to bring a friend along. I decided to ask Lovell if she would like to go. I didn't think she even liked baseball, but much to my surprise, she said yes. On Thursday afternoon, I was alone in the film center, editing the movie. I was having difficulty focusing on the task at hand, so I went out to the stairway and sat down. It was a beautiful spring day, and the sun was pouring in through the windows, but I was miserable. I could sense that something wasn't right, and my anxiety level was through the roof. It was an extremely long and unproductive afternoon. Lovell seemed a little preoccupied as we traversed the 100 miles from Keene to Hampton. At one point, I put my hand on her knee. She smiled and held on to it. I knew something was on her mind. When we arrived at my folks' house, it was nearly midnight. A few minutes later, we were climbing into bed. We snuggled up close and lay there quietly for a few minutes. Hesitantly, Lovell broke the silence. Dan, I'm so deeply sorry. I would never do anything to hurt you, but we're going to have to stop seeing each other. My body went numb. I knew this moment would eventually come, but I never expected it would come this soon. I told her that I had sensed for several days that something was wrong, and that all afternoon I had felt such awful anxiety that I couldn't even concentrate. She felt terrible about that. This was not an easy thing for her to tell me, but she was deeply concerned about how attached we were becoming to each other, and with graduation just around the corner, she had to focus on her responsibilities. I understood how she felt. This was a difficult conversation for both of us, but at least the awful anxiety we were feeling was broken. I pulled her close to me and we fell asleep. We were both so emotionally exhausted that I don't think either of us moved an inch that entire night. The morning of Friday the 13th dawned bright and sunny. We met up with the Fords and headed off to Fenway Park. Opening day of the baseball season is a religious event in Boston, and there was excitement in the air. Unfortunately, the Red Sox gave up 8 runs to the Detroit Tigers in the top of the first inning and ended up losing an agonizingly long game, 13-9. I felt bad that Lovell had to endure such a marathon of a game. As we drove back to Keene that evening, the reality of what Lovell had said really began to sink in. She could sense that I was having difficulty and asked me several times if I was all right. I told her I was, but I found myself wishing that the road back to Keene would never come to an end. With the end of the school year fast approaching, I continued working my way through editing the movie to have a version ready to show at the Student Film Festival at the end of the semester. Later that week, Lovell and I were at Film Society. I was happy to be with her, but now there was an unspoken awkwardness that I felt when we were together. At the end of the evening, she came over to me and said, "Would you like some company tonight?" I wasn't expecting that. I was thrilled that she wanted to spend the night, but now it was bittersweet. When she would leave in the morning, I had no way of knowing if that would be our last time together. My life had become an emotional roller coaster. As usual, we packed Drennan Auditorium for the Student Film Festival. Students and faculty came from all over campus to see the best of the student films from that year's production class. The films were very well received. Peter showed his film, Aphrodisiac City, that we all had so much fun making. And of course, Bob Gunther and I showed Just You and Me. It was our first chance to get an audience reaction, and everyone truly enjoyed it. We all had a wonderful time. Unlike previous years, where my film would often be the last film shown, this year my friend Joe Jakowski had that honor. Joe managed to keep his film, titled Murder Over Miami, a secret. None of us knew what to expect, but with Joe's sense of humor, we knew it would be funny. Joe's film turned out to be a spoof of Just You and Me. It was hysterical. The audience was roaring. I was never more flattered in my life. The interesting part was that Bob Gunther had a somewhat unanticipated reaction. Bob told Joe that he enjoyed his spoof of our film, but that he should have gotten our permission to avoid copyright infringement. Of course, if Joe had asked us for permission, it would have spoiled the surprise. It was an odd reaction, but Bob was always teaching us something. I thanked Joe and told him how flattered I was. You know that you've arrived when other filmmakers spoof your work. It was the last day of finals. The spring semester was at an end. I had taken my last exam and was in my room packing for the trip home. To say I was feeling depressed would have been an understatement. I was listening to some music and expecting Lovell to stop in to say goodbye. A short while later, there was a knock on my door. She came in, sat down beside me, and put her arms around me. We sat there for a few moments. Neither of us quite knew what to say to the other. Finally, she asked, "Are you okay?" I managed a small smile, and with a slight touch of sarcasm said, "No." She smiled. I was going to miss that beautiful smile. I tried to thank her for everything that she had done for me, for acting in my film, being my friend, and my lover. But my words were clumsy and clouded with emotion. In fact, words were not enough to express how I felt about her. She tried her best to console me. She said, "Dan, you're going to have a wonderful love life. Someday, you will meet someone, and you will forget all about me." I looked at her and said, "Lovell, I will never, ever forget about you." At that point, my emotions got the best of me. I had to look away. No one forgets their first love. Then she very tenderly said to me, "Let go, Dan. Just let go." All I could do was nod. Let go, I thought. How on earth does one do that? She stood up. It was time for her to go. I stood and faced her. We looked at one another and embraced. I wanted that embrace to last forever. Ironically, at that very moment, Linda Ronstadt sang the lyric, "And I think I'm gonna miss you for a long, long time." Lovell stepped towards the door, stopped, turned back towards me, and said, "You know, there is one thing you should do." "What's that?" I said. "Burn that record." I had to smile. She turned, and she was gone. As I returned to my packing, I was overcome by a terrible, empty feeling. It was going to be an incredibly sad and lonely ride home. We did see each other one last time later that summer, just a few weeks before she left for Santa Fe. To be honest, it was an uncomfortable visit. She was quiet and distant, and seemed uneasy around me. As she was about to leave the next morning, the weight of the moment was almost too much to bear. As we were saying our final goodbyes, I said, "I'm never going to see you again, am I?" She couldn't answer me. We were both fighting our emotions. Finally, she looked up at me and said, "Goodbye, Dan." "Goodbye, Lovell." She followed me in her car as I led her back to Route 101. As we approached the turn for Route 95, I put my arm out and pointed towards Manchester to show her which direction to go. I then waved a final goodbye. I saw her hand come up briefly, and I watched her car until it disappeared from sight. Tears were streaming down my face. But even in my grief, the metaphorical symbolism of that moment was inescapable. As her little blue Datsun was heading west towards Keene and her future, I was turning north towards Portsmouth and mine. As I write these words 36 years later, I'm reminded of a line from the film The Natural. We all have two lives, the life we learn with and the life we live with after that. 9 years ago, I joined Facebook and began searching for old friends that I'd lost touch with from high school and college. In less than half an hour, I found Lovell. It was so nice to reconnect with her after all that time. I had often wondered what had become of her after we lost contact with each other. We exchanged stories about our lives and families. She seems happy, and yes, so am I. As she predicted, I found someone else that I love very dearly. Our relationship was like a shooting star across the sky of my life. It was bright, intense, and beautiful for a short period of time, and just as quickly, it was gone. I can honestly say that I have never missed another human being as much as I missed Lovell after she left for school. She had truly touched my heart, and it took years for the pain of losing her to fade. I'm glad we're still friends. I look back on our time together and I treasure it. I will always have a special place in my heart for her. The next time I saw Bob Gunther was in 1991 at Keene State College for the 20th anniversary of the Keene State College Film Society. Bob was the same as ever. It was so good to see him again. As a former president of the Film Society, I was asked to speak to the assembled crowd. I talked about my time as president and some of the extraordinary events that happened during my tenure. I also told a few funny anecdotes about Bob, which were appreciated by all who knew him. I made a point to thank Bob publicly for all he had done to help me as a filmmaker and for being such a good friend. Sadly, that was the last time I ever saw Bob. He died on March 1st of 2003. In many ways, it was Bob who had brought our little group of friends together. In fact, if it hadn't been for Bob, Lovell and I may never have gotten together, and my film, Just You and Me, that he produced, would have been an entirely different project without his input. Bob Gunther enriched my life more than I possibly could have imagined. I am forever grateful. He was my friend and mentor, and I miss him to this very day. As to the rest of my friends from the film program, I am still in touch with most of them. Kathy Turnus and Peter Condon are both still friends of mine. Larry Benequist is now retired and is a professor emeritus at Keene State and is still teaching classes there. I can never repay Larry for everything he has done for me over the years. We all have teachers who affect our lives in profound ways, and Larry Benequist is one of those teachers. Larry helped to carve a path for my success. He did everything in his power to provide me with opportunities I never would have had elsewhere. I am forever in his debt. The film program at Keene State would not exist without Larry Benequist, and I am honored to have been one of its very first students. In the fall of 1980, a couple of weeks before I was about to head off as a freshman to Keene State College, my mother gave me these words of wisdom. She said, "You know, Danny, at college, you're going to meet people who will become your friends for the rest of your life." I remember thinking, friends for the rest of my life. I couldn't even imagine who these people might be. What will their names be? What will they be like? It was almost as if I had written a script for a film, but didn't know who the characters were, or what their role in the story would be. My mother was so right. Now, I can't imagine my life without these incredible people. They all had a part to play. They all enriched the story. And they are all irreplaceable parts of the screenplay of my life.
Of you, oh, what hijacked my world at night, to a place in the past we've been cast out of. Oh, now we're back in the fight. Put us back on the train. Us to live like we do, bring me to my knees when I see what they've done to you. But I'll die as I stand here today, knowing that deep in my heart they'll fall to ruin one day for making us part. A picture of you. Ah, those were the happiest days of my life.